International news now.
So we're going to move on to tariffs now? All right, okay, so now we're going to talk about our second main story, and this is going to bring us back to talking about trade policy and tariffs. And we're going to talk about three main aspects of this story. The first is new tariffs against China. The second are the extensive exemptions granted on the aluminum and steel tariffs since we discussed them last time or in the past. And the third is a new trade agreement with South Korea. So let's start with China. Last Thursday, President Trump directed the U.S. Trade Representative to begin putting together a list of tariffs that would be assessed on Chinese imports into the United States. And the Trade Representative has a couple of weeks to do this. Now, his justification is different this time than the national security claims made around the tariffs on aluminum and steel. President Trump has accused China in this instance of a 301 violation, which charges that they have engaged in unfair trade practices that discriminate against U.S. imports and are in violation of prior trade agreements between the two countries. More specifically, Trump charges that Chinese firms have been forcing American firms to transfer technology to them, which violates the intellectual property of American firms. The tariffs will target imports in the technology sector, including aeronautics, modern rail, new energy vehicles, and other high-tech products. Now, the size or scale of these new tariffs is still undetermined. They could be imposed on imports valued between $30 and $60 billion. The stated goal of this policy is to reduce America's trade deficit with China by $50 billion. Now, currently, the U.S. trade deficit with China is about $375 billion annually. So this means China exports $375 billion more in exports than America's total exports to China. Now, these actions activated concerns about a broader trade war between China and the United States last week and sparked a sharp sell-off on Wall Street. The stock market went way down. Now, it has recovered yesterday because the Chinese government responded to the threat of tariffs in a very restrained fashion, saying it would impose new tariffs on just $3 billion of American exports to China. So, okay, that's the background. Now we want to listen to an NPR audio clip that provides some additional background to this story. So let's run that clip now.
President Trump today ordered stiff new tariffs on Chinese imports. A White House advisor says the president's goal is to shrink the U.S. trade deficit with China by at least $50 billion a year. The move marks a significant escalation of Trump's America First trade policy, and it prompted a nervous reaction on Wall Street today. The Dow Jones Industrial Average tumbled more than 700 points. In a moment, we'll hear about how U.S. companies doing business in China feel about the president's action. But first, we're joined by NPR's White House correspondent, Scott Horsley. Hey, Scott.
Hi, Elsa.
So why did the president take this action today?
Well, U.S. businesses have complained for a long time about the way China treats their intellectual property. They say they're often forced to share their technology know-how as a price of doing business in China, and that sometimes their tech secrets are stolen outright. Now, the White House says that the U.S. administrations have been trying to talk with China about that for years, going back to the George W. Bush administration, but that talk was not producing the desired change in Chinese behavior. So President Trump said this afternoon, it's time to get tough.
We have a tremendous intellectual property theft situation going on, which likewise is hundreds of billions of dollars.
Administration economists spent months studying this and came up with what they say is a conservative estimate that China's unfair practices of technology cost the U.S. economy some $50 billion a year. And so that's what they're trying to counteract with these tariffs. The president has directed his top trade negotiator to come up with a list of Chinese products to target over the next 15 days. And he's also directed the Treasury Secretary to look at new limits on China's investment in the United States.
We saw a really sharp sell-off on Wall Street today. I mean, it seems like investors are pretty worried about this move. Why is that?
Yeah, it was a sharp sell-off. All the major market indices were down more than 2%. The Dow was off nearly 3%. You know, even though a lot of business people agree with the president that China needs to change its conduct, they're worried about this tariff tactic that the president is using. They say it's going to bring higher prices here in the U.S. and possible retaliation by China against U.S. exports. That's why you saw dozens of trade groups, including the Chamber of Commerce, the National Retail Federation, farm groups, writing the president last weekend, urging him not to impose tariffs. And you've heard similar concerns from members of Congress, including the president's fellow Republicans. Here's Senator Orrin Hatch, who was speaking this week at a forum sponsored by the Business Roundtable as well as a farm group. He says the tariffs might backfire.
Chinese companies don't pay U.S. tariffs. Rather, American companies and American consumers get the bill. This is a tax hike, pure and simple.
China was also quick to criticize the president's move. A statement from the Chinese embassy here in Washington said China does not want a trade war with anyone, but it will not recoil from one. It added if a trade war is initiated, China would fight to the end to defend its own legitimate interests.
Are there concerns beyond the economy?
There are certainly strategic concerns. This is another case where the president is sort of acting on his own and runs the risk of alienating U.S. allies, even those who share his concerns about China's conduct. And also, when it comes to North Korea, you know, Trump has been counting on support from Chinese President Xi Jinping, and he's been getting good cooperation. That's one reason he hasn't taken tough trade action until now. He now runs the risk of losing that cooperation as a result of this move.
You know, this move is just the latest provocative trade move by the Trump administration. Just a couple weeks ago, the president ordered tariffs on imported steel and aluminum. What's happening with those?
Yeah, those tariffs are due to take effect tomorrow, but they've been watered down a good deal. Canada and Mexico were already exempted, and today we learned that the administration is exempting the European Union, South Korea, Australia, Argentina, and Brazil. So it's going to be interesting to see if something similar happens with the China tariffs over the next 15 days.
That's NPR's Scott Horsley. Thanks, Scott.
You're welcome.
All right, first let's talk about the consistency here with his America First grand strategy that's really centered on core economic principles around mercantilism, or we talked about this before, around neo-mercantilism. President Trump talked about going after China economically during the campaign, and he's doing it with these tariffs. He had held off on those until now. What's the broader critique of this America First economic grand strategy? It's that relatively free international trade is hurting the United States. It's leading to an outflow of wealth from the United States to other countries around the world. We can see this outflow in the trade deficit and the explosion of this bilateral trade deficit with China. So what does the U.S. have to do? It has to institute new trade policies that are designed to redistribute wealth back to the United States, to cut Chinese exports to the United States, and to enhance American exports to China. Now, second, these tariffs are targeted at the high-tech sector. The idea here is we got to go up the value chain, because in the long run, this is where the growth is going to be created. If China is stealing intellectual property in the high-tech sector, these are where new jobs and growth is going to be created in the long run. So without protecting these sectors, the United States could be at a bad or an economically disadvantageous position 10, 15 years from now. All the dynamic returns economically are going to be in these sectors. They're not going to be in steel and aluminum. Third, we see opposition from Republicans on these tariffs. We have quotes here and discussion of Orrin Hatch calling the tariffs a tax on American consumers that are going to raise prices, right? He's saying the Chinese firms aren't going to have to pay for these tariffs. The American consumers will. There's also concerns about Chinese retaliation that could hurt red state industries. Agriculture, soybeans is a big example of this. There's concerns that if China imposes retaliatory tariffs on soybeans, then American ag will get hurt, and Brazil and Argentina are just going to step into the gap there. Now, fourth, the story raises the national security concerns associated with North Korea. The U.S. needs China for leverage on North Korea, but China is North Korea's, and this leverage is generated because China is North Korea's main trading partner. So the U.S. relies on China to threaten to close down that trade to pressure North Korea into compliance in the nuclear deal. And the concern is, could a trade war with China derail the North Korean talks? Would China be less likely to pressure North Korea to come to the bargaining table? I'd say be skeptical here. China has a strong interest in de-escalating the North Korean nuclear crisis, and it has a strong interest in keeping these things separate. And we can see these interests, I would argue, in the measured or restrained Chinese response last week to this new threat of tariffs. Last Friday, the Chinese government announced it would impose 15% tariffs on $3 billion of American exports to China, right? $30 to $60 billion of trying to limit $30 to $60 billion of exports from China to the United States with these tariffs. China's responding by hurting $3 billion of American exports to China. And right now they're saying that they're going to target pork, think Iowa and the Midwest, fruit, wine. I mean, wine is kind of a throwaway because as California, that's a blue state. And seamless steel pipes. That was a new one I hadn't thought about before. I don't know what the political interests are of that one. Moreover, the $3 billion number intentionally looks like it was chosen as a response, not to the tariffs that were the new tariffs on China that were threatened last Thursday. Instead, it's a response to the prior steel and aluminum tariffs because China exported $2.8 billion of steel and aluminum to the U.S. last year. So it looks like that the two sides might be quietly negotiating a way out of this tariff war. China's also said that it's going to file international law, or it's going to follow international law on this trade dispute. They're going to file an appeal and a case within the WTO, and they're going to let that process work. And they're just kind of waiting to see how the U.S. Trade Representative is going to respond. All right, so let's come to the second part of the tariff story, and this is the status of the steel and aluminum tariffs announced a few weeks ago. Remember all the controversy this generated. There was a temporary sell-off on Wall Street. We had talks about trade wars with American allies like Canada, South Korea, and Europe. The sky was falling. Europe was threatening to go into a trade war, and they were going to start by going after Kentucky bourbon, Harley Davidsons, and blue jeans. Well, guess what's happened? The administration has now extended exemptions from these tariffs to the following countries: Argentina, Australia, Brazil, South Korea, Canada, Mexico, and the European Union. If you look at your slide right now, this means that the U.S. is granting exemptions to all the main exporters of steel to the United States. This exemption means that these countries and that steel companies from these countries will not face the tariff, the 25% tariff on steel or the 10% tariff on aluminum. These are significant exemptions because they basically cover all the main exporters of these products to the United States. In short, no trade war with American allies because they've all been granted exemptions. The tariffs will not be applied to them. And what do these exemptions mean? It means that there will be minimal effects on international trade in aluminum and steel. There's just not a lot there. Right? There was lofty, tough rhetoric, but the administration has stepped back significantly. And frankly, if I was a steel or aluminum CEO that got called into the White House for that big meeting, I'd be saying, what just happened? Right? Well, you promised me lots of money so I could hire new people, and that ain't happening now.
So no trade war, that's good, but also no protection for the poor steel and aluminum industries, which is at least not following through on what he promised. So
and then there's a third part of this story that we want to discuss. Yesterday, the administration announced a new trade deal with South Korea, and it's going to argue that this trade deal was facilitated by the threat to impose new tariffs on steel. The U.S. did grant South Korea an exemption on steel, but in return got a series of other trade concessions from South Korea. In particular, South Korea is going to restrict its own exports of steel to the United States by to about 70% of levels from 2014 to 2017. This means they're cutting steel exports from 3.6 million metric tons a year to 2.7 million metric tons a year. That's, frankly, it's small potatoes. South Korea also agreed to double the number of U.S. cars that could be exported to the United States that don't meet South Korean local safety standards. Now the U.S. can sell 50,000 cars instead of their prior limited to 25,000 cars. Guess what? no American car company sells more than 10,000 a year. So basically what happened was they had a deal. Both sides can say we scored important political concessions. There's not going to be really any impact on international trade. This was largely for show, but what's important, it allows the two sides to eliminate any appearance of economic conflict as they move into conversations about the North Korean nuclear program. So it's a political win for both sides, and they can focus on nukes.